The chipped ceramic mug warmed Roy's hands, the coffee inside lukewarm and bitter. He didn't much care. The taste was less about enjoyment and more about the ritual. 6 a.m. coffee. Then the river, always the river. He sat on the porch, the weathered planks groaning faintly under his weight, and watched the mist cling to the surface of the black river, an opaque shroud swallowing the far bank. It was October in the Ozarks, the hillsides a ryan color. But the beauty felt muted, distant. He hadn't seen a single vibrant leaf flutter down in the last hour. Everything hung suspended, waiting. Roy hadn't always lived like this. 20 years ago, he'd been a detective with the St. Louis PD. Good at his job, too good, maybe. Chasing shadows, confronting darkness. He'd been married, had a life, a normal one. Then came the Crawford case, a string of disappearances, a suspect who slipped through his fingers, and a wife who couldn't bear the ghosts he brought home with him. He traded concrete and sirens for pine and water, a badge for a fishing rod. Now he was a ghost himself, haunting the edges of a life he once knew. The cabin built by his grandfather was his sanctuary, a rough-hewn fortress of solitude. He'd added to it over the years a small workshop for fixing his equipment, a screened-in porch to watch the river flow. But the core remained the same, simple, solid, stubbornly independent. He finished the coffee and set the mug on the porch railing. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy. It wasn't the natural quiet of the woods. He knew that quiet. He'd spent years cultivating it. This was different, damp, oppressive. It was the absence of sound, truly, no birdsong. Usually, even this early, the chickadees and cardinals would be chattering, staking claim to the last of the berries. Squirrels, ever busy, would be scrabbling through the leaves. Today, nothing. Not even the rustle of wind through the trees. It was as if the forest held its breath. He pulled on his worn wading boots, the leather cracked and supple from years of use, and grabbed his fly rod. The fiberglass felt familiar in his grip, a comforting weight. Fishing wasn't about catching anymore. It was about the rhythm of the cast, the gentle tug of the current, the illusion of connection to something larger than himself. The river was cold, numbing his legs almost instantly. He waded out, casting towards a submerged log where Bass liked to lurk. Nothing. He tried a different spot, a deeper eddy near the riverbank. Still nothing. It wasn't the lack of fish that bothered him, though. It was the pervasive silence. An unnatural stillness clung to the water, mirroring the woods. He'd fished this stretch of the Black River for 15 years, and he'd never experienced anything like it. He worked his way downstream, the gravel shifting under his boots. The sun, a pale disk behind the mist, began to burn through distorted shadows. That is when he saw old man Hemlock by the road. Hemlock, a weathered farmer with a face like a dried apple, was leaning against his pickup, hands shoved deep in his pockets. His hound Blue was usually at his side, but not today. "Mornin', Roy," Hemlock greeted, his voice raspy. "Morning, Earl," Roy replied, wading back to shore. "Quiet one out there," Hemlock grunted. "Too quiet. Been looking for Blue since yesterday evening. Took off after a rabbit, he did. Usually comes back. Hunting dogs wander. Earl, he'll turn up." Roy knew that logic didn't always apply in these hills. Dogs disappeared. People disappeared. Sometimes they just vanished. Hemlock shook his head. "This ain't like him. He is a good tracker. Wouldn't get lost. And there ain't been a scent, Roy. Not a one. Usually I can pick up something. Even after a day." He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the gravel. "Probably just a coyote got to him. Happens every year." But his eyes, normally crinkled with good humor, held a shadow of worry. Roy offered a sympathetic nod. "Sorry to hear that. Hope you find him, Earl." "Thanks," Hemlock said, then turned and climbed into his truck. the engine rumbling to life. "Just a dog," he muttered, more to himself than to Roy. Roy watched him drive away, a knot forming in his stomach. A dog disappearing wasn't unusual, but the way Hemlock said it, the lack of a scent, it resonated with the unsettling silence of the woods. He walked back to the cabin, feeling a prickle of unease he hadn't experienced in years. He needed something to occupy his mind, to dispel the growing sense of dread. He decided to work on the roof, patching some loose shingles before the winter storms hit. As he climbed the ladder, the memory surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. It was 15 years ago, almost to the day. October, the same oppressive quiet. He'd been visiting his parents, who lived in a small town about 50 miles from here. His father, a park ranger, had noticed the same unsettling stillness in the woods. "Something's not right, Roy," he'd said, echoing Roy's own thoughts now. 3 days later, his parents' car was found abandoned on a logging road, doors open, keys in the ignition. They were never seen again. The case went cold, another unsolved mystery, lost in the vastness of the Ozark Mountains. He tried to dismiss it then, a coincidence, a tragic accident. But now, staring at the silent woods, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was revisiting a nightmare. He spent the afternoon patching the roof, forcing himself to focus on the physical labor. Hammering, fitting shingles, the smell of tar and wood filling his nostrils. It helped, a little, but the silence remained, a constant, gnawing presence. As dusk settled, he decided to take one last walk along the riverbank. He needed to clear his head, to convince himself that he was being paranoid, that everything was normal. It wasn't. He walked further downriver than usual, past the bend where the water slowed and deepened. The mist had thickened again, swirling around his feet like ghostly fingers. That is when he saw them. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, shadows, playing on the muddy bank. But as he got closer, his blood ran cold. They were tracks, massive, deeply impressed in the soft earth. Not deer, not bear, not anything he'd ever seen before. They were too large, too humanoid in shape, but far too big to be human. Each print was almost 2 feet long with broad, splayed toes. He knelt down, carefully examining the tracks. The mud was still damp, suggesting they were recent. There were several of them, leading down to the water's edge and then disappearing, as if whatever made them had simply walked into the river and vanished. He traced the outline of one of the prints with his finger, a tremor running through his hand. He'd spent years in law enforcement, seen his share of disturbing things. But this was different. This wasn't something born of human malice. It was something else entirely. Something ancient, something terrifying. He stood up slowly, scanning the riverbank, his eyes searching the encroaching darkness. The silence had intensified, becoming absolute, suffocating. The air grew heavy, charged with an unseen energy. A twig snapped in the woods behind him. He whirled around, his hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife he carried on his belt. But there was nothing there. Just the trees, the mist, and the oppressive silence. He strained his ears, listening for another sound. But there was only the thundering of his own heart. Then he looked back at the riverbank and saw that, where there had been only 3 tracks before, there were now 5 freshly made and moving towards him. The call came just after dawn, shattering the fragile peace Roy had managed to rebuild. Sheriff Brody, a man whose face permanently wore the expression of someone smelling something unpleasant, was on the line. "Roy, got a situation out in Hemlock Hollow." Roy already knew it wouldn't be a simple missing person. Hemlock Hollow. The name itself carried a weight, a resonance of isolation and forgotten things. It was a bowl of wilderness, ringed by steep hills and shrouded in perpetual shadow. Even at midday, people avoided it. Locals whispered that the hollow held onto its secrets. "Hiker?" Roy asked, already lacing his boots. "College kid, name of Daniel Carter. From St. Louis, was here on fall break. parents filed a report last night. He hasn't been seen since yesterday afternoon. Brody's tone was dismissive. Probably just a runaway or got himself lost. Happens all the time. Hemlock Hollow isn't the kind of place you get lost in easily, Brody. It is small. Look, I'm just telling you what I think. But the parents are persistent. Figured you might be willing to lend a hand. Know the woods better than most. Roy hesitated. Getting involved meant stirring up the past, dredging up memories he'd spent years burying, but the image of his parents, lost in these same hills, flickered in his mind. He couldn't ignore it. "All right," he said, resigned. "I'll head out there." The drive to Hemlock Hollow was unsettling. The air grew colder as he climbed, the trees closing in overhead, blocking out the sunlight. The colors of autumn seemed muted, drained of their vibrancy. It mirrored the landscape of his own solitude. The sheriff's cruiser was parked at the trailhead, a lonely sentinel guarding the entrance to the hollow. A handful of volunteers milled around, looking anxious and ill-equipped. Brody was talking to Daniel Carter's parents, a distraught couple trying to hold themselves together. "Roy," Brody said, spotting him. "Good. You can take the southern loop. Carter was last seen heading that way. Check for any sign of him, anything at all." He handed Roy a grainy photograph of a young man with a bright, optimistic smile. The contrast between the photo and the somber atmosphere felt jarring. Roy took the photo, nodded, and started into the woods. The silence was even more profound here, heavier, more oppressive than he'd experienced on his own property. He walked slowly, deliberately, his senses on high alert. He examined the ground, looking for footprints, broken branches, anything that might indicate the hiker's path. He passed a cluster of ancient oaks, their branches gnarled and twisted like skeletal arms. A sense of being watched prickled at the back of his neck. He dismissed it as paranoia. Still, he kept his hand close to the knife on his belt. He didn't find much on the trail itself. Soutier discarded water bottle, a crumpled energy bar wrapper. Nothing that pointed to foul play, or even a struggle. But the absence of something was more unsettling than any evidence. There were no signs of the hiker, having tried to find his way back. No panic thrashing through the undergrowth, no discarded map. It was as if he'd simply vanished. He reached the small, general store in the hamlet of Havenwood, the closest semblance of a town to Hemlock Hollow, hoping to get a better sense of the area. Old Man Tiber, the store owner, was a fixture in Havenwood, a gnarled and taciturn man who seemed to know everything and say nothing. "Heard about the boy," Tiber said, wiping down the counter with a rag. "You know anything about Hemlock Hollow?" Roy asked, trying to sound casual. Tiber's eyes narrowed. "It is a wild place, always has been. Best left alone. Folks avoid it. Some do. Others, they got their reasons for going in there." He paused, studying Roy's face. "You askin' about Old Man Hemlock?" The name, it was the one he'd expected to hear. "Who is Old Man Hemlock?" Roy asked, feigning ignorance. Tiber chuckled, a dry rasping sound. "Now there is a story. Old Man Hemlock. Real name Silas Blackwood. Lives deep in the hollow. Always has. Been there longer than anyone can remember. Keeps to himself. Folks say he made a deal with something in those woods a long time ago. Something old. A deal. That is the story. To protect his land, keep his family safe. Whatever it was, it changed him. Turned him different. Folks say he knows things. Things he shouldn't. Roy pressed cautiously. "What kind of things?" Tiber stopped wiping the counter and leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "About the woods. About what lives in the woods. About things that were here long before us. They say he can call on. Help if he needs it." "Help from what?" Tiber just shook his head, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of fear and reverence. Let's just say some things are better left undisturbed. Roy thanked Tiber and left the store, the old man's words echoing in his mind. A deal with something ancient in the woods. It sounded like folklore, a local legend meant to scare children, but the unsettling quiet of Hemlock Hollow, the hiker's inexplicable disappearance, Tiber's fear, it all felt too real. Back at the trailhead, he overheard Deputy Miller talking to one of the search volunteers. Sheriff thinks the kid probably just panicked and wandered off, probably hasn't eaten or drunk anything since yesterday. He has been known to have anxiety. But wouldn't he try to find his way back? The volunteer asked. Maybe. Or maybe he just kept going, hoping to find help. It is a big woods, easy to get turned around. Miller shrugged. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if a bear got to him. Roy approached them. Anything. Nothing, Miller replied curtly. Just more nothing. You have any luck down there? Not really, Roy said, deliberately vague. The trail's clean. Too clean. It is like he just disappeared. Brody emerged from the trees looking exasperated. Look, Roy, I appreciate your help, but I don't need any armchair detectives. We're running a professional search. We'll find him. He paused, his gaze narrowing. You weren't snooping around asking questions in town, were you? Just making conversation, Roy said, keeping his voice even, trying to get a feel for the area. Brody snorted. Don't waste your time listening to old wives' tales. Hemlock Hollow's just a wild place. Dangerous, that is all. Maybe, Roy conceded. Or maybe there is more to it than that. Brody's face flushed with anger. I'm the sheriff, Roy. I'll decide what there is to it. Roy backed down, not wanting to escalate the situation. He knew Brody, stubborn, territorial, and fiercely protective of his authority. He was also a pragmatic man, more interested in closing cases than uncovering the truth. Roy continued the search. Hours passed, the light fading as the day wore on. The forest seemed to grow darker, more menacing. He found nothing, not even a scrap of clothing. It was as if Daniel Carter had been swallowed by the woods whole. He was about to head back to the trailhead when he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. He'd veered off the main path, following a game trail that led deeper into the hollow, when he saw it, carved into the trunk of a towering oak, almost hidden by a curtain of vines. It wasn't a name, or initials, or any kind of message he recognized. It was a symbol, a perfect spiral, contained within a sharply defined triangle. The carving was fresh, the wood still pale. It didn't look like something a lost hiker would do. It looked intentional, deliberate, and profoundly disturbing. He reached out to touch it, his fingers tracing the smooth contours of the carving. A wave of nausea washed over him, a sense of dread so intense it almost brought him to his knees. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this symbol was connected to Daniel Carter's disappearance, and that whatever it represented was far more dangerous than anything he could have imagined. He noticed, in the fading light, that the spiral wasn't carved into the tree, but from the tree as though something had been drawn out, leaving this strange mark as a residue. Then he heard it, a faint sound, carried on the wind, a whisper. It seemed to come from all around him, a disembodied voice murmuring something he couldn't quite decipher. But he knew with terrifying clarity that it wasn't the wind, and it wasn't alone. The symbol burned into Roy's mind, a persistent afterimage behind his eyelids. He stared at the photograph he'd taken of it, the stark contrast of the carving against the rough bark amplifying its unsettling effect. It wasn't just a shape, it felt familiar, and then it hit him, a fragmented memory, a phantom pain in his chest. Sarah Jennings, 8 years old, gone without a trace. He hadn't thought about Sarah in years. He deliberately buried the case along with the guilt that consumed him. He'd been a detective in Boone County at the time, fresh off a string of successful cases, confident in his abilities. Sarah's disappearance had shattered that confidence. He'd found a similar carving near the creek where Sarah had last been seen. A spiral within a triangle etched into the base of an old sycamore tree. He dismissed it then, chalking it up to a child's crude drawing. Now, staring at the photograph, he knew it wasn't the work of a child. It was something far older, far more sinister. The memories flooded back, unbidden and brutal. The frantic search, the tearful parents, the mounting pressure. He turned the county upside down, interviewed every resident, followed every lead. Nothing. Sarah had vanished as completely as if she'd dissolved into the air. He remembered the hollow ache in his wife's eyes as she watched him slip away, consumed by the case. She'd tried to be supportive, but the darkness had clung to him, infecting their life together. He'd stopped sleeping, haunted by Sarah's face. He'd become obsessed, poring over maps, folklore, anything that might offer a clue. The case had eventually gone cold. Another unsolved mystery filed away in the archives. He'd requested a transfer, moved here, seeking solace in the isolation. He'd believed escaping the reminders would heal him. He'd been wrong. He hadn't realized how deeply the case had scarred him until now. The symbol was a key, unlocking a Pandora's box of repressed trauma, and it suggested that Sarah's disappearance hadn't been a random tragedy, but part of something far more disturbing, something that was happening again. He drove back to the cabin, the image of the symbol seared into his vision. He needed to understand it, to find its origin, to stop it from claiming another victim. He fired up his ancient computer, the monitor flickering to life. He started with Old Man Hemlock. Silas Blackwood, a name whispered in hushed tones. He found a few articles, mostly local news snippets from decades past. Blackwood had inherited a vast tract of land in Hemlock Hollow from his family, land that had been in their possession for generations. He delved deeper, scouring online forums and historical archives. He discovered a trove of local folklore, tales passed down through generations about a forest spirit known as the Hollow Walker. According to legend, the Hollow Walker was an ancient entity, a guardian of the woods, both benevolent and terrifying. It was said to maintain balance within the forest, protecting its creatures and resources, but it demanded a price. The legend spoke of offerings, of sacrifices made to appease the Hollow Walker, not always human, sometimes animals, sometimes objects of value. But when the balance was severely disrupted, the Hollow Walker demanded something more substantial. A life. The stories varied in their details, but one theme remained constant. The Hollow Walker's power was tied to the land, particularly to Hemlock Hollow, and according to the legends, standing relationship with the spirit, serving as its intermediaries for centuries. Roy felt a chill crawl down his spine. Silas Blackwood, obsessed with these legends, living in the heart of the Hollow. It was too much of a coincidence. He spent the rest of the day researching ancient symbolism, searching for clues to the meaning of the spiral within a triangle. He found references in Celtic mythology, where the spiral represented growth, evolution, and the cyclical nature of life and death. The triangle, in many cultures, symbolized protection, stability, and the divine. But combined, the symbols took on a darker meaning, a portal, a gateway, a summoning. He tried to reach Sheriff Brody to share his findings, but Brody was dismissive, brushing aside his concerns as superstition and old wives' tales. "I'm dealing with a missing person, Roy, not a ghost story," Brody said, his voice tight with irritation. "Focus on the search and leave the folklore to the locals." Roy hung up the phone, feeling a surge of frustration. He was on his own. Again, he decided to go back to Hemlock Hollow to see if he could find anything else. Any other sign of the symbol. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. He walked along the riverbank, his senses on high alert. He passed the spot where he'd found Daniel Carter's water bottle, then continued onward, deeper, into the hollow. That is when he saw it, parked haphazardly on the shoulder of the dirt road, overlooking the river, was Earl Hemlock's pickup truck. The driver's side door was open, the keys dangling in the ignition. Roy's heart leaped into his throat. He ran towards the truck, his fear escalating with every step. He looked inside, empty. He scanned the surrounding woods, calling out Earl's name. But there was no response, just the oppressive silence of the hollow. Then he spotted it, lying on the muddy bank near the river, a single shed antler, one of a deer's, large and imposing. But it wasn't the antler itself that sent a jolt of terror through him. It was the sight of Earl's overturned and abandoned truck, coupled with the chilling realization Earl Hemlock, along with his missing hound Blue, had vanished too. The air grew cold, and the scent of damp earth, usually comforting, now carried a metallic tang. He saw something else then, barely visible in the gathering dusk, closer to the trees, partially obscured by underbrush. Another of the symbols, the spiral within a triangle, carved into the bark of a beech tree, glowing faintly as if absorbing the last vestiges of light. And this time, around the carving, a scattering of fresh dirt, as if something had been recently. The antler felt strangely cold in Roy's hands, heavier than it should have been. It was massive, easily 6 feet in span, from tip to base. He turned it over, examining the points, the smooth, polished surface. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The bone wasn't simply large, it was distorted. A grotesque asymmetry ran through the structure. One side was normal, albeit exceptionally big. The other was gnarled, twisted, with bony protrusions jutting out at unnatural angles. Knots and burls bloomed along the beam, as if the antler had grown in agony. He ran his hand along the warped sections, a growing sense of dread washing over him. This wasn't a natural deer, not anymore. It was as if the very structure of its skeleton had been manipulated. He remembered Old Man Tiber mentioning that Hemlock's cattle often suffered from deformities, birth defects that defied explanation. He dismissed it as inbreeding, the result of generations of limited genetics. Now, he wasn't so sure. He followed the faint tire tracks of Earl Hemlock's pickup. Tracing the farmer's last known route, the tracks led deeper into the hollow, along a barely discernible logging road that hadn't been used in years. The further he went, the more unsettling the landscape became. Trees leaned at impossible angles, their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers. Patches of the forest floor were devoid of vegetation, the soil barren and cracked. He found more tracks, not just Hemlock's tires, but the same massive humanoid prints he'd discovered near the river. They weren't fresh, but they were numerous, crisscrossing the area, suggesting whatever made them had been here, repeatedly. And along the side of the road he found patches of disturbed earth, as if something heavy had been dragged through the mud. He stopped at a clearing, a small meadow swallowed by encroaching trees. The air hung heavy with a cloying sweetness, a floral scent that felt artificial. Wrong. He noticed a pattern to the disturbed earth. It formed a rough circle, like a ritualistic boundary. And in the center of the circle, a single, withered flower lay crushed beneath a heavy object. He continued on foot, abandoning the truck. He needed to get a closer look to understand what had happened here. He found a discarded piece of blue fabric caught on a thorn bush, a fragment of Hemlock's work shirt, he suspected. He reached the spot where Daniel Carter had last been seen, guided by the coordinates Brody had provided. He'd already searched this area, but now, driven by a desperate sense of urgency, he examined it more closely. He moved through the undergrowth, pushing aside ferns and vines when he saw it. Hidden amidst the foliage, carefully concealed, lay a small doll. It was crudely crafted, made of twigs and mud and scraps of cloth. It was roughly the size of a child's hand, and it bore a disturbing resemblance to Daniel Carter, with exaggerated features and hollowed-out eyes. Its limbs were bent at unnatural angles, twisted and contorted. Roy felt a wave of nausea wash over him. This wasn't the act of a random killer. This was ritualistic, deliberate. This was sacrificial. He picked up the doll gingerly, feeling a strange energy emanating from it, a sense of despair and violation. He needed answers. He drove back to Havenwood, seeking out Mrs. Abernathy, the town's unofficial historian. She was a woman in her 80s, with a sharp mind and an encyclopedic knowledge of local law. He found her in the town's tiny library, surrounded by stacks of books and genealogical charts. "Mrs. Abernathy, I need your help," he said, showing her a photograph of the spiral within a triangle. She adjusted her spectacles and examined the image. "Ah, yes," she said, her voice raspy with age. "The weaver's knot, an ancient symbol, very old. What does it mean?" "It dates back to the Osage tribes who lived here long before the settlers arrived. They believed the forests were inhabited by spirits, powerful entities that needed to be appeased." "Appeased how?" "Through offerings, gifts, and sometimes sacrifices." Roy's blood ran cold. Sacrifices. The Osage believed that the spirits demanded a balance. If the forest was disturbed, if resources were depleted, or if the people acted disrespectfully, the spirits would demand a payment, a life for a life. Was this symbol associated with those rituals? The weaver's knot was used to mark sacred sites, to create a gateway through which the spirits could enter our world. It was believed to amplify their power. She paused, her eyes fixed on Roy. The Osage also spoke of a protector of the forest, a solitary being, half man, half beast, that wandered the hollow, judging who was worthy of the forest's grace and who was not. Did they have a name for this being? They called him the Hollow Walker. Roy felt a chill crawl down his spine. The legends, Old Man Hemlock, the symbol, the disappearances. It was all connected. And it was all terrifyingly real. Did the rituals always involve human sacrifice? He asked. Not always, but when times were desperate, when the balance was severely disrupted, the spirits demanded the ultimate offering, a human life. She shook her head sadly. The Osage eventually abandoned these practices, realizing the price was too high. But the spirits, they say, never forget. Roy left the library, his mind reeling. He needed to warn Brody, to convince him that this wasn't just a couple of missing persons cases. This was something far more dangerous, something rooted in ancient evil. He returned to his cabin, hoping to find some semblance of peace. But his sanctuary had been violated. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin was quiet, almost too quiet. He noticed immediately that something was off. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, a sense of being watched. He checked the windows, the doors, making sure everything was secure. He found nothing amiss. Then he spotted it. A small white envelope slipped under the door. He picked it up, his hands trembling. He opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The message was handwritten, scrawled in a spidery, unsettling script. There was only one sentence. "The walker hungers." The note felt like a brand on his skin. The walker hungers. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. A chilling pronouncement of intent. Roy knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in his veins, that he had to go into the hollow. Not to search, not to investigate, but to confront. He armed himself, not with the casual preparedness of a seasoned outdoorsman, but with a grim determination honed by years of facing darkness. His service weapon, a Glock 19, dusted off and loaded. A hunting knife strapped to his thigh. A flashlight, its beam cutting through the growing gloom. The trail wasn't too difficult to follow, not anymore. It wasn't too about tracks or signs. It was about a sense of direction, a pull towards the heart of the hollow. He descended into a labyrinthine gorge, the trees growing thicker, the air colder and heavier with each step. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the crunch of leaves under his boots. The gorge narrowed, the walls rising on either side, blotting out the sky. He passed a gnarled and ancient oak, its trunk riddled with holes, looking like a skull grinning in the darkness. He noticed something etched into the bark, a faint, almost obscured spiral within a triangle. It was everywhere, a malignant signature, staining the landscape. He found a scattering of what looked like bone fragments, bleached white by the elements, small bones, animal, maybe. But the thought lingered that they might be something else. The trail ended abruptly at a wall of dense undergrowth. He pushed through it, forcing his way into a hidden clearing. The sight that greeted him stole his breath. It was a place of ancient power, a natural amphitheater surrounded by towering trees. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, crudely constructed from weathered rocks. The altar was stained with a dark, viscous substance that looked sickeningly like dried blood, and carved into the front of the altar, dominating the entire surface, was the weaver's knot thapi, the spiral within a triangle. Around the altar were remnants of a ritualistic practice, scattered feathers, twisted branches, arranged in bizarre patterns. The air thrummed with an unsettling energy, a palpable sense of dread. And then he saw him. Standing in the shadows, partially obscured by the trees, was a figure that resembled Old Man Hemlock. But it wasn't the frail, stooped farmer he'd briefly seen. This man was taller, broader, his face gaunt and hollow, eyed, his skin stretched tight over his bones. He was dressed in animal hides, adorned with feathers and bones. He looked wild. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure rasped, his voice a guttural growl. "This place is not for you." Roy leveled his Glock. "Who are you?" The figure laughed, a hollow echoing sound. "I am Silas, the keeper, the walker." It wasn't Old Man Hemlock. It was someone claiming to be him, someone consumed by the law, twisted by generations of isolation and dark ritual. "You're delusional," Roy said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're kidnapping people, sacrificing them to what? An imaginary spirit?" The walker's eyes burned with fanaticism. "The walker is no myth. He is the heart of the forest, the guardian of the balance. What is owed? Respect, obedience, sacrifice." "You're insane. I am fulfilling my destiny, a destiny passed down through generations of my family, a destiny to protect this land, to appease the walker." He raised his hands, revealing long, wickedly sharp claws fashioned from bone and metal. "And you, detective, are trespassing on sacred ground." The walker lunged, moving with a speed that belied his gaunt frame. Roy fired, the shot echoing through the clearing. The bullet struck the walker in the shoulder, sending him staggering back. But it barely seemed to faze him. He roared, a primal scream that resonated through the forest, and charged again. He was surprisingly strong, his attacks savage and relentless. Roy dodged and weaved, firing off shots, but the walker kept coming, driven by a manic energy. They fought hand to hand, a brutal, desperate struggle for survival. The walker was relentless, his claws tearing at Roy's arms and legs. Roy countered with swift, precise strikes, using his training to his advantage. He disarmed the walker, knocking the bone claws from his grasp, but the walker just kept coming, using his fists, his feet, his teeth. Roy managed to land a solid punch to the walker's jaw, sending him stumbling backward. He followed up with a kick to the stomach, doubling him over. The walker fell to his knees, gasping for air. "Why?" Roy demanded, his voice hoarse. "Why are you doing this?" The walker looked up, his eyes filled with a terrifying intensity. "They chose her, you see. They chose her." "Who chose who?" The walker's lips curled into a chilling smile. The walker, of course. Sarah Jennings. She wasn't lost, detective. She wasn't a random victim. She was chosen. A gift to appease the forest spirit. Roy's blood ran cold. Sarah Jennings. The case that had haunted him for 15 years. He'd believed she'd been abducted, murdered, but the walker was saying she'd been chosen, and Daniel Carter. Roy asked, forcing the words past his lips. He was a replacement. The walker wasn't satisfied. He needed another offering. The balance must be maintained. The walker scrambled to his feet, his eyes gleaming with renewed fanaticism. And you, detective, you're interfering with the natural order. You're disrupting the balance. You must be silenced. He charged again, but Roy was ready for him. He sidestepped the attack and brought his knee up, catching the walker in the groin. The walker cried out in pain and collapsed to the ground, clutching his abdomen. Roy stood over him, his gun trained on his head. He could end it now, end the madness, stop the sacrifices. But as he looked down at the walker, he saw something in his eyes, a flicker of something that wasn't madness, but sorrow, a lifetime of isolation, of indoctrination, of believing he was doing the right thing, no matter how twisted. Before he could pull the trigger, the walker spoke, his voice barely a whisper. She is still alive. Roy froze. What? The child? Sarah Jennings. She is not gone. The walker keeps her safe. But she must remain untouched, a permanent offering, a symbol of our devotion. He pointed a trembling finger towards a hidden cavern at the back of the clearing, concealed behind a waterfall. She is in there. Roy's grip on the gun tightened, alive after all these years, but held captive, a prisoner of this madman and whatever twisted entity he served. As he glanced back at the fallen walker, he noticed a dark stain spreading across his own jacket. He hadn't realized he'd been wounded during the struggle, a deep gash across his side bleeding freely. The walker looked up, a strange, knowing smile on his face. You've barely scratched the surface. Detective, he rasped. The walker always gets what it wants. The weight of the walker's words pressed down on Roy, suffocating him. Sarah Jennings, alive. After 15 years of grief, of guilt, of assuming the worst, she was alive. But the price of that survival was horrific. A permanent captive, a living offering to a deranged ideology. He stumbled back, momentarily paralyzed by the revelation. His mind struggled to reconcile the image of the bright, vibrant girl he remembered with the idea of her being held prisoner in a dark, damp cave, forced to endure a life stolen from her. He pressed a hand to his bleeding side, reminding him of the immediate task. He had to get to the cave. He had to save Sarah, and Daniel Carter, and Earl Hemlock, and anyone else the walker had taken. He secured the walker, binding his hands and feet with rope salvaged from a nearby shed. It wasn't a proper arrest. It was containment. He doubted Brody would even bother to follow up, trusting Roy's judgment as little as he did. He followed the walker's directions, navigating through the dense undergrowth towards a hidden waterfall. Behind the cascading water, obscured by moss and vines, was the entrance to a cave system, dark, ominous, and reeking of damp earth, and something else, something ancient and indefinable. He took a deep breath, trying to steel himself for what he might find inside. He activated his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing a narrow passage that sloped downwards. The air grew colder, the silence more profound. He moved slowly, cautiously, his gun raised, his senses on high alert. The passage opened into a series of interconnected caverns, illuminated by flickering torches, placed strategically along the walls. And then he saw them. Daniel Carter, weak but alive, huddled in a corner, his eyes wide with fear. Earl Hemlock, bruised and battered, but conscious, attempting to comfort a terrified Blue, his hound. And in the center of the largest cavern, chained to a stone pillar, was a woman, Sarah Jennings. She was no longer the 8-year-old girl he remembered. She was a woman now, in her early 20s, with haunted eyes and a fragile frame. Her clothes were ragged, her hair matted and tangled, but there was no mistaking her. It was Sarah. A wave of emotion washed over Roy, relief, joy, fury, and a profound sense of guilt. He'd spent years mourning her loss, believing she was gone forever, and all the while, she'd been here, trapped in this subterranean prison. He moved quickly, freeing the captives, offering them water, and what little comfort he could. Daniel and Earl were shaken, but relatively unharmed. Sarah, however, was emotionally and physically scarred. She flinched at every touch, her eyes constantly darting around, searching for an escape. "It is okay," Roy said gently, trying to reassure her. "You're safe now. I'm going to get you out of here." She just stared at him, her expression blank. He said I was chosen, that I had to stay." Roy squeezed her hand. "He is wrong. You're coming home." As they made their way out of the cave, Roy confronted the walker, who was still bound and gagged. "Why?" Roy demanded, his voice raw with anger. "Why hold them captive? What purpose does this serve?" The walker's eyes burned with fanaticism. "I am preserving the balance, protecting the forest." The walker demands respect. He demands sacrifice. These offerings ensure the continued health of the land. "You're insane," Roy said, his voice trembling. "This isn't about protecting the forest. It is about your own twisted desires. You don't understand." The walker shouted, struggling against his restraints. "The modern world has forgotten the old ways. We've destroyed the natural order. The walker is the last defense against chaos. He must be appeased." "You're a murderer," Roy said, his voice filled with contempt. "A sick, twisted individual who justifies his crimes with ancient mythology." The walker just laughed, a hollow, echoing sound. "You'll see. The walker will return. The balance will be restored." Roy ignored him, focusing on getting the captives to safety. He led them out of the hollow, towards the waiting sheriff's cruiser. Brody, predictably, was less than thrilled to see him. "What the hell happened here, Roy?" he demanded. "I found them, Brody, all of them, held captive in a cave." Brody's expression shifted from annoyance to disbelief. "A cave? What are you talking about?" Roy recounted the events, omitting the details about the walker's claims regarding Sarah Jennings. He didn't want to subject her to further questioning, further trauma. He just wanted to get her to safety. Brody reluctantly agreed to take custody of the walker and the rescued captives. He still seemed skeptical, dismissing the walker's actions as the work of a deranged hermit. Roy stayed with Sarah, ensuring she received medical attention and support. He watched as she slowly began to come to terms with her ordeal, her eyes regaining a flicker of hope. He knew the road to recovery would be long and difficult, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered. As he sat with her, a disturbing thought occurred to him. The walker had spoken of balance, of the walker demanding respect, of being a guardian of an ancient power. What if the walker wasn't just a madman? What if he was truly connected to something older, something darker? He returned to the cave one last time, determined to find answers. He searched every nook and cranny, every hidden chamber, looking for clues. He found nothing until he reached the deepest part of the cave system, a small, secluded grotto. There, carved into the wall, hidden behind a curtain of moss, was a symbol he hadn't seen before. It was a variation of the spiral within a triangle, but with a crucial difference. Within the triangle, surrounding the spiral, was a circle, encompassing the entire design. It pulsed with an unsettling energy. He traced the edges of the symbol with his finger, a chilling realization dawning on him. This wasn't just a symbol of appeasement. It was a symbol of continuation, a promise that the tradition would not end with the walker, that the hunger would remain, that the cycle of sacrifice would continue, waiting for a new keeper to emerge. He felt a cold dread creep into his soul. He'd stopped one madman, but he hadn't eradicated the evil that had driven him. It was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to rise again. And he knew, with a sinking heart, that his own journey had just begun. The forest hadn't relinquished its hold on him. Not yet. He was irrevocably connected to it now, bound by a shared history, a shared trauma, and a looming, unspoken destiny. The courtroom was small, the atmosphere thick with tension. Silas Blackwood, the man who'd called himself the Walker, sat impassively, his eyes vacant, seemingly detached from the proceedings. He barely reacted as the judge read the sentence, Subban, life imprisonment without parole. It felt insufficient. A cage couldn't contain the darkness that had consumed him. Roy sat in the back, watching the spectacle unfold. He testified, recounting his experiences in Hemlock Hollow, detailing the Walker's twisted rituals and the horrors he'd witnessed. He'd shielded Sarah from further scrutiny, allowing her to begin rebuilding her life in peace. Seeing her there, slightly pale but remarkably composed, offering a small, grateful smile, was the only solace he found. Daniel Carter and Earl Hemlock offered their own testimonies, their voices trembling with emotion. Earl, reunited with Blue, his faithful hound, seemed to have regained a measure of his former jovial self. But the shadow of his ordeal lingered in his eyes. As the bailiff led the Walker away, Roy felt a strange sense of emptiness. Justice had been served, but it hadn't brought closure. It hadn't erased the images seared into his memory, or the unsettling questions that haunted his mind. He wondered if Silas Blackwood was truly alone in his madness, or if he was merely the latest in a long line of keepers bound to the Walker's will. He accompanied Sarah to the bus station, watching as she boarded, heading towards a new life, a new beginning. She turned and offered him one last smile, a genuine expression of gratitude. "Thank you, Roy," she said softly, "for everything." He just nodded, unable to speak. He watched the bus pull away, carrying her further and further from the darkness of Hemlock Hollow. Returning to his cabin felt strange, as if he were entering a different world. The familiar surroundings, Saibi, the chipped mugs, the worn furniture, the scent of pine and wood smoke seemed alien. Tainted by the horrors he'd experienced, he'd spent years creating this sanctuary, a refuge from the outside world. Now, he wasn't sure it was enough. He spent the next few days in a daze, attempting to re-establish his routine, to recapture the sense of peace he'd once known. He fished, he chopped wood, he repaired the roof, but nothing felt the same. The silence of the woods, once a source of comfort, now felt oppressive, pregnant with unseen threats. Slowly, gradually, the forest began to awaken. The birdsong returned, tentative at first, then growing louder and more confident. Squirrels darted through the trees, their chattering filling the air. The woods were healing, reclaiming their vibrancy. But Roy couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched. He'd catch glimpses of movement in the periphery, shadows flitting between the trees. He'd hear faint whispers on the wind, just beyond the range of comprehension. He knew, instinctively, that the darkness hadn't been vanquished. It had merely retreated, waiting for an opportunity to resurface. He started changing his routine. He began locking the doors and windows at night, something he hadn't done in years. He sharpened his hunting knife, keeping it within easy reach. He started carrying a flashlight with him, even during the day. Small, subtle changes, but they made him feel safer, more prepared. He also began studying the local folklore, delving deeper into the legends of the Hollow Walker, searching for clues to its origins, its weaknesses. He learned that the Walker was believed to be tied to the land, drawing its power from the ancient forests, the hidden caves, the forgotten springs. It couldn't be destroyed, only contained. One evening, as dusk settled, he was walking on the porch, sipping coffee, when he saw it. Lying on the weathered planks, just beyond the doorway, a single, shed antler. It wasn't as grotesquely deformed as the one he'd found near Earl Hemlock's truck, but it was large, imposing, and undeniably out of place. It felt like a message, a silent warning, a reminder that the walker's legacy might linger, even behind bars. He picked up the antler, turning it over in his hands. It felt cold, lifeless, yet imbued with a strange, unsettling energy. He stared into the darkening woods, his senses on high alert. The forest was silent again, but this time it wasn't an empty silence. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the walker wasn't gone. His influence hadn't been completely eradicated. It was merely dormant, biding its time, waiting for a new keeper to emerge, to continue the cycle of sacrifice, to appease the ancient spirit of the hollow. He placed the antler on the mantel above the fireplace, a grim trophy, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked in the Ozark hills. He knew he couldn't truly rest. He couldn't truly find peace. He would always be vigilant, always be watching, always be prepared to defend himself and his community against the forces that lay hidden beneath the surface of the world. The woods were silent, but Roy wasn't fooled. He knew the silence was a lie, and he knew, with a profound sense of foreboding, that the walker was still listening, still waiting, still hungry. His sanctuary wouldn't be the same, but now it was a fortified sanctuary, a silent, watchful sentinel against the darkness, guarding not just his peace, but a fragile hope for the future.